The most powerful woman in Europe just got exposed on live television in front of the entire world, and she couldn't answer a single question. Ursula von der Leyen, the woman who commanded 450 million Europeans, who brought Apple, Google, and Meta to their knees, who threatened Elon Musk with the full force of European regulatory power, stood at that podium in the European Parliament, visibly shaking as members of her own institution dismantled her reputation piece by piece, document by document, lie by lie. And then she walked out, not gracefully, not with dignity. She walked out when the evidence was on the screen behind them and there was absolutely nothing left to say. The crowd didn't stay silent. They erupted. And right now, across 27 European nations, millions of ordinary citizens are demanding one thing and one thing only: her resignation. What you are about to discover is the complete story of how the most untouchable bureaucrat in modern European history got destroyed in a single afternoon, why it was inevitable, and why the European Union will never be the same again. The destruction of Ursula von der Leyen's credibility was years in the making, built on a foundation of secret deals, deleted messages, and a level of arrogance so profound that she genuinely believed she was above accountability. To understand what happened in that parliament chamber, you have to understand who this woman actually is. Not the carefully constructed public image of a competent technocratic leader, but the real Ursula von der Leyen, who operated in the shadows of Brussels with absolute confidence that no one would ever expose her. Von der Leyen rose to the presidency of the European Commission in 2019 under circumstances that were already deeply controversial. She was not the candidate the European Parliament wanted. She was not the candidate the European public had voted for. She was installed by a backroom deal among EU heads of state who needed someone they believed they could manage and control. The vote that confirmed her presidency passed by a margin of only 9 votes out of 751 members. 9 votes. That is how close the European Union came to never having Ursula von der Leyen as its most powerful executive. But those 9 votes were enough, and from that razor-thin mandate, she proceeded to accumulate more personal power than any Commission president in the entire history of the European Union. She centralized decision-making inside her personal cabinet in ways that bypassed the traditional Commission structure entirely. Senior commissioners who had been elected and confirmed to manage specific policy areas found themselves sidelined from major decisions that fell directly within their responsibilities. Her inner circle of personal advisors, people who answered only to her and had no democratic accountability whatsoever, began making calls that shaped European policy for 500 million people. Career officials who had spent decades building expertise in European institutions found their input ignored in favor of whatever von der Leyen's personal team had decided behind closed doors. This was not how the European Commission was designed to function. This was not the transparent, accountable, rules-based institution that Brussels constantly claimed to represent. This was one woman running a 27-nation political union like her personal operation, and she did it for years with almost no consequences. But the cracks began showing in 2021, and they appeared in a way so embarrassing, so publicly humiliating, that it should have ended her career immediately. The incident that Europeans came to call Sofagate happened on April 6, 2021, during an official visit to Turkey. Von der Leyen traveled to Ankara alongside European Council President Charles Michel to meet with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The protocol called for 2 chairs of equal standing to be placed for the 2 European leaders. When they entered the room, there were indeed 2 chairs, but both chairs were taken by Erdogan and Michel. Von der Leyen, the highest-ranking executive official of the European Union, was left standing in front of the cameras of the entire world with nowhere to sit. She eventually lowered herself onto a sofa positioned off to the side, visibly uncomfortable, clearly humiliated, while the 2 men conducted official business from positions of equal formal standing. The images went around the world instantly. The symbolism was brutal and impossible to ignore. The most powerful woman in European politics had been literally sidelined, pushed onto a couch while the men ran the meeting. European feminist organizations exploded with outrage. MEPs from across the political spectrum demanded an explanation and her resignation. And what was the official response from Brussels? Charles Michel's team suggested the seating arrangement had followed diplomatic protocol correctly. Von der Leyen's team complained privately, but said almost nothing publicly. The incident was quietly buried under procedural language and institutional non-answers. Nobody resigned. Nobody was held accountable. Von der Leyen absorbed the humiliation, smiled through it, and continued accumulating power as if nothing had happened. That pattern, the pattern of causing damage, avoiding accountability, and continuing forward as if consequences didn't apply to her, defined her entire presidency. and nothing defined it more completely than the scandal that was now blowing apart in the European Parliament, with every camera in Europe pointed directly at her face: the Pfizer text message scandal. During the COVID-19 pandemic, von der Leyen personally negotiated a vaccine contract with Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla, worth 1.8 billion doses and approximately 35 billion euros of European taxpayer money. This was the largest procurement contract in the entire history of the European Union. The negotiations happened through direct personal text messages between von der Leyen and Bourla, bypassing the standard procurement processes that European law explicitly required for contracts of this magnitude. Those processes existed for a reason. They existed to ensure transparency, to prevent corruption, to guarantee that European citizens could see how their money was being spent and by whom. Von der Leyen conducted the entire negotiation in secret on her personal phone through messages that were never officially recorded, never entered into the official Commission communication archives that EU transparency law required, and were never disclosed to European Parliament members who had the legal right to review them. When journalists from the New York Times first reported the existence of these text messages in April 2021, the European Commission's response was extraordinary in its brazenness. They claimed the messages had been deleted, not archived, not stored in a secure location pending legal review. Deleted, gone, permanently erased from a device used to conduct the single largest public procurement negotiation in European Union history. The European Parliament demanded the messages immediately. The European Ombudsman, the official institution responsible for investigating maladministration in EU bodies, launched a formal inquiry and found that the Commission had engaged in what they officially classified as maladministration by failing to preserve and disclose the communications. That finding from the EU's own internal oversight body was essentially a formal determination that von der Leyen had broken the rules. It was the kind of finding that should have triggered immediate parliamentary proceedings, formal censure, and serious questions about whether she could continue in office. Instead, von der Leyen stared down every inquiry with the same unshakable confidence she had displayed since 2019. She appeared before committees. She gave carefully crafted non-answers that acknowledged nothing and admitted nothing. She deployed her legal team to bury investigators in procedural objections that delayed every inquiry for months. She relied on the fundamental political reality that removing a Commission president required an absolute majority vote of the European Parliament, a threshold that her political allies could always prevent from being reached. She was untouchable. She knew it, and she acted accordingly right up until the moment she walked into that Parliament chamber and came face to face with someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this confrontation, with evidence she had never expected anyone to actually obtain. What that MEP pulled out of that folder, and what appeared on the screens behind von der Leyen in front of the full Parliament session, was something that her entire legal and communications apparatus had spent 4 years trying to ensure would never become public. And the moment those documents hit the screen, the moment the chamber saw what was actually in them, the entire carefully constructed facade of European institutional competence and democratic accountability began collapsing in real time. So what exactly was in those documents? And why, when she saw them on that screen, did the most powerful bureaucrat in European history suddenly lose the ability to speak? The MEP who stood up in that chamber was not someone von der Leyen had ever taken seriously. That was her first mistake. Romanian MEP Cristian Terheș had been filing formal complaints, submitting parliamentary questions, and demanding document disclosures about the Pfizer contract for nearly 3 years. For 3 years, the Commission had stonewalled him with procedural delays, incomplete responses, and the kind of bureaucratic silence that Brussels had perfected into an art form. Most MEPs would have given up. Most politicians would have moved on to easier battles with better headlines. Terheș did not move on. He built his case document by document, source by source, with the patience of someone who understood that the truth was buried under layers of institutional protection and that digging it out would take exactly as long as it took. What he placed on the screen behind von der Leyen that afternoon were internal Commission communications that had been recovered through a combination of legal discovery processes in an ongoing Belgian court case, leaked documents from inside the Commission itself, and cross-referenced procurement records that the Commission had been legally compelled to release through repeated ombudsman rulings. Together, they told a story that was far worse than anyone outside Brussels had understood. The Pfizer contract had not simply been negotiated informally through personal text messages. The document showed that the Standard Procurement Committee, the body of independent experts whose entire purpose was to evaluate major contracts and prevent exactly this kind of political interference, had been deliberately excluded from the negotiation process at von der Leyen's personal direction. Internal emails showed Commission officials explicitly instructed not to involve the procurement oversight structure. One recovered communication showed a senior advisor writing that the president wanted this handled at the personal level and that standard channels were not to be engaged for this process. That single line on the screen behind her, in 72-point font, visible to every camera in the chamber, was the most damaging thing that had ever appeared in a European parliamentary session in living memory. But it was the pricing document that made the chamber go completely silent. The contract that von der Leyen personally negotiated with Albert Bourla locked in a per-dose price for Pfizer vaccines that was significantly higher than the prices simultaneously negotiated by individual European member states acting on their own, and dramatically higher than the prices other non-EU nations secured during the same period for the same product. Belgium had independently secured doses at a lower price before the Commission contract superseded individual nation negotiations. Denmark had comparable data. The documents showed that the centralized Commission contract, the one personally handled by von der Leyen through messages that were then deleted, had cost European taxpayers billions more than transparent competitive procurement would have produced. The overpayment calculations that Terhij displayed, built from the Commission's own released data, showed European citizens had paid between 7 and 13 billion euros more than necessary for vaccines that other countries acquired at demonstrably lower cost. 7 to 13 billion euros of public money gone because the standard oversight processes had been bypassed by one woman negotiating on her personal phone with a pharmaceutical CEO. Von der Leyen stood at that podium, and the transformation was visible to everyone watching. This was not the polished, controlled, unflappable Commission president who had faced down Elon Musk and lectured American tech giants about European values and the rule of law. This was someone who had just watched the evidence she believed was permanently buried appear on a screen behind her in front of 705 MEPs, dozens of cameras, and a live broadcast reaching millions of European citizens. She reached for her prepared notes. She began delivering the standard response about proper procedures and institutional processes and ongoing legal matters that prevented her from commenting on specific documents. And then something happened that Brussels had never seen before. The chamber didn't let her finish. Not from the left, not from the right, not from the center. MEPs from parties that had never agreed on a single issue in years of parliamentary sessions were on their feet simultaneously, shouting the same demand in 7 different languages. The word was unmistakable in every one of them. Resign. The session chair attempted to restore order 3 separate times. Each time, the noise grew louder. Italian MEPs who sat on opposite ends of the political spectrum were standing side by side. French conservatives and French progressives, who had spent years attacking each other over domestic politics, were unified in a single moment of institutional outrage. Even members of von der Leyen's own European People's Party, the political family that had protected her through every previous scandal, sat in visible silence rather than defending her. That silence from her own allies was more devastating than any shouting from her opponents. When your own party won't stand up for you in the moment you need them most, the entire chamber knows the political calculation has already shifted and the protection that kept you untouchable has quietly been withdrawn. Von der Leyen attempted to continue speaking twice more. Both attempts collapsed within seconds as the noise made it impossible. Her communications director, seated in the official gallery above the chamber floor, was visibly on his phone throughout the entire sequence. And anyone who has spent time around political crisis management recognized exactly what that meant. The spin operation was already being assembled in real time. The emergency messaging being drafted, the friendly media contacts being alerted, the damage control infrastructure being activated. But this time, the damage was happening too fast and too publicly for any spin operation to contain it. Because while that chamber descended into chaos, the clip of those documents on the screen behind a speechless von der Leyen was already being shared by millions of Europeans who had never watched a parliamentary session in their lives and were watching this one because they had been waiting years for exactly this moment. She gathered her papers. She spoke briefly to the aide standing directly behind her. And then Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, walked away from the podium in the middle of an active parliamentary session, something that violated the procedural rules of the institution she ran, and disappeared through the side door while the chamber erupted behind her. The walkout lasted 11 seconds. Those 11 seconds were filmed from 4 different angles, and by the time she reached the corridor outside, those 11 seconds had already been viewed by 34 million people. But what was waiting for her in that corridor was something even her crisis team hadn't anticipated, because the story didn't end when she walked out of the chamber. It was just beginning, and what happened in the next 4 hours would make everything that occurred inside that room look like a minor opening act. What you just watched was not a political disagreement. What you just watched was the complete and total unraveling of the most protected bureaucrat in modern European history. Live on television in front of the entire world with no way to walk it back and no way to make those documents disappear a second time. Ursula von der Leyen spent 5 years building an empire of regulatory power so vast that she genuinely believed no parliament, no court, no journalist, and no elected official could ever touch her. She was wrong, and the 34 million people who watched those 11 seconds of her walking out of that chamber in silence are proof that the wall she built around herself has finally, completely, and permanently collapsed. The European public is not staying quiet anymore. Protests have erupted in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw. Petition drives demanding her formal resignation have collected over 2 million signatures in less than 48 hours. MEPs who spent years afraid to challenge her publicly are now lining up to speak on record. The institutional protection that kept her untouchable has evaporated overnight. And somewhere in a Brussels corridor, the woman who threatened Elon Musk with the full force of European regulatory power is facing something she has never faced before in her entire career: actual consequences. This story is not finished, not even close. The Belgian court case continues. The Ombudsman investigation has been reopened with new evidence. 3 separate member state governments have formally requested an independent audit of the entire Pfizer procurement process. And inside the European Parliament, the vote count for a formal censure motion is being quietly assembled by people who now believe, for the first time, that the numbers are actually there. If you want to know exactly what happens next, subscribe right now, because the next video covers the resignation demands, the censure vote countdown, and the one document that her legal team is desperately trying to suppress before it reaches the public. Drop a comment below telling me whether you think von der Leyen survives this or whether her time is finally up. Hit that like button if this video gave you information the mainstream media is refusing to cover. The truth is coming out, and we are going to be here every single step of the way.